Or shall we start?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Sure.
Okay. So thank you very much, Amy, for inviting me to come and talk today. Maybe just as a little bit of a background, and it's you sort of see, I guess, the resonance of it in the work as well. So even though maybe I've been doing this for a very long time, or what feels like a very long time. But so in a previous life, in my first degree, I actually was doing science with a major in mathematics.
Wow.
So I was quite sort of looking at the world in possibly a slightly different way. But that sort of resonates in the work still. So what I found is that post sort of doctorate, or through the doctorate process, that I realised that there was sort of many ways of that I was looking at the world and its sort of influence in the way that I was actually conceptualising sort of the notions of landscape. And I should also then mention that, so I did a PhD, which was a PhD in design research. So it critically explores the sort of theoretical positioning of of the research question through design projects, as well as sort of positioning it within a written dissertation as well. And that through that process, what became quite evident was the act of the designer and the act of making as being sort of a critical component of not just of representing the work, but actually of its making as sort of, in a way, a contractual sort of understanding, not in terms of a highly legal sense, but in a way the agency of the drawing, the agency of what we draw in terms of, its sort of influence in the world. And so you'll see sort of resonance of that, and obviously, and I guess the Bacon reading was sort of, in a way, attempting to sort of give you a bit of an origin of where some of that understanding comes from, or a moment of that sort of understanding that comes from, and also that reading sort of is quite sort of, in a way, visual in terms of its explanations. Mm-hmm. The talk's just broken down into 4 sections. So the notion of the section is the continuum, the section is material ecologies, the section is field of information, and then finally the section is emergent structures. And sort of, so starting with this notion of the section as a continuum, some of the key aspects in here is noting that, I guess, as sort of in our sort of modes of, in the Design Act, I guess what we're sort of suggesting here is that we're connecting back to, I guess, maybe what you've been presented previously, is that in our Design Act we're actually constructing these notion of histories, or sort of traces that get that are visualised through the sort of the act, like the projected understanding we'll never actually really see that, but what we do see is sort of it's the histories of the landscape. Mm-hmm. For those who have seen some of this stuff before, I apologise. So I'll just keep on going. Yeah. So maybe, firstly, the notion of the thickened ground is both here as expressed as something that's relational, but also understood as sort of dynamic, and that these relationships and the dynamics that are inherently embedded in it are what produces the notion of space. So the terrain is understood as the interface, produced from sort of grounds, material depths, in concert with atmospheric forces that engender and support a performative condition. So when we're looking at these examples of stellarch, that we're actually, and I start off with this because I think it's sort of a very sort of maybe gruesome example of how we begin to question the notion of its surface or the grounds but that we're actually understanding sort of these surfaces and grounds as something that's both continually remade, but also of an extension of many other factors. So when we look at the image of Stelarc on the right, who's a performance artist for those who don't know, what we're seeing here is that he's in suspension for a period of time, but that suspension, so he has sort of a range of hooks that are connected to his body, and that surface is continually being remade by the pressure of him being sort of suspended in the air. Yeah. So it's alive to a certain extent. The sort of forces are alive. And that the rocks and sort of the atmospheric conditions, if we imagine that there's air in the room, are actually causing that sort of condition to be continually in sort of a performative state. But the other questions that it brings up is that, when we understand the notion of the surface, where do we see its sort of beginning, and also where do we see its end? So do we see that the surface is actually an extension of the rocks, or are we just seeing the surface as sort of just the skin on his body? And then sort of vice versa. Then we can sort of go, well, is the skin sort of, is it just a thin condition and that the organs are separate, or is it the organs and the skeleton that are inherently in his body an extension of that surface as well? So the argument that I make is that, in a way, that we can't consider sort of the notion of the skin or that surface condition that we often refer to as that sort of singular plane as singular, but one that we need to consider it holistically and then actually capture everything that's in that image, because that's sort of what's in a way influencing this sort of thickened section. One of my favourites, so in some of the work in sort of, so looking at Lake Eyre. Now, Lake Eyre is sort of a large salt lake that's in the centre of Australia. It used to be the edge of the continent, but also it's now sort of in Doric Lake that for most of its life it is just a dry salt lake that has incredibly flat. And then in other states of its life, when it does flood and rain a lot, it becomes sort of a lake sort of for a short period of time. But what these images of Murray Fredericks sort of capture is that, and what you're seeing is that sort of very thin line that sits in between the image is actually a moment where you see the horizon sort of emerge. But what you're seeing is that there's no sort of distinct sort of figure-ground type of relationship, or really anything that measures the ground in sort of a conventional manner. We do get sort of figurative conditions of the clouds, but to a certain extent there's the conventional measures of how we capture this landscape, in a way, defy sort of our conventional forms of representation. So this becomes sort of quite crucial in the way, and in a way this is why it's sort of a continual ongoing question, is that each sort of site or condition that we sort of work within, how do we begin to think of it, the sort of, in a way, the act of representing as one of an act of making, but also the act of representing as sort of a very crucial sort of question about sort of what agency we have in the world, what we're saying about the world, and also its forward sort of traces, its historical traces that it might actually produce. So it was. This was it's an ongoing work, and I constantly sort of visit this location when I can, in the sense that it's a location that sort of forces us to not use sort of Western forms of conventions of representation, but actually what are the alternatives. So this is the constant sort of maybe lifelong question, and that each site actually forces you to think about that differently. So when we look at it, even from an aerial perspective, so this is when it's full, it is sort of a really difficult figure to capture, and this is capturing it at one moment in time. So again, sort of, and here we're just sort of representing it through gradients of, I guess, blue and reds or ochres. But when we sort of look at its complexities, just by the mere fact of its scale, that it forces a different form of engagement, but also different forms of acting when we're thinking about it at this sort of large scale, let alone sort of at the scale that we sort of, the images that I started with, that we're at sort of the 1-to-1. So as we sort of move through, we're used to sort of very particular forms of measures, so particular forms of surveying, particular forms of measuring ground, and sort of, again, sort of very specific types of conventions. So I guess what the work asks, or continually asks, is what, rather than sort of implying a very sort of, in a way, often Cartesian sort of overlays of ways of measure, how might we sort of measure the ground differently? So then the study starts to look at how we might sort of use, rather than sort of a generic grid, an overlay of a generic grid, how might we begin to set up, and this is sort of just capturing certain, there's one of salt movement and also another of bird migration. How do we begin to set up sort of relational conditions that allow for a very particular form of measure that are not of a generic nature? So here what the attempt was in this body of work was going, okay, how, if I'm setting up, as in a way, not using sort of, the grid or the protractor, how do I set up, or an encoding method that allows me to sort of capture information, that allows me to represent this landscape differently, that I can then work with and continually encode to build something else. And then sort of moving at different scales, then it sort of became a negotiation, looking at negotiation through very other systems. So we start sort of, I guess, negotiating between the grid, but also in the image to the right, to a certain extent, we are not only representing sort of, again, those historical sort of shifts, or projected shifts, but we're sort of speculating, in a way, a field condition that generates another set of, a range of points that are sort of representative of a range of information. It looks abstract, but it's not. Well, in a way, it's an abstraction of information anyway, so any form of drawing is. But what it was trying to do is that there's, in a way, data sheets that, if we think of data as sort of a fact of real, which is questionable, that actually feed back into the drawing itself. So hence why when I show this image, it was a mediator in terms of a range of information, a range of forms of representation that was trying to be negotiated. Okay, so moving on. So now sort of moving into this notion of section as material ecologies. And sort of thinking about sort of, in a way, conceptually the notion of the thickened ground. I guess what we're arguing, or what I'm arguing, is that the thickened ground, if we come back to the sort of the reference to stellar, is not something that happens just in an XY plane. So it's not sort of a singular plane. That it is one that happens in sort of multiple planes. So we often understand sort of the XY or XY sort of Z. So we're seeing sort of that sort of capture. So this is just a sort of a general sort of thesis on the argument or question. Then we're also suggesting that there's forces that are determining that sort of cross-section that are both coming from above but also below. So it's, again, sort of being influenced by multiple factors that come into play. And then we're also thinking about the cross-section as one, not necessarily that the notion of depth is the notion of time. So that we're seeing the T, or that sort of line that you're seeing, my mouse? Yeah. The line that you're seeing sort of as the, if I can get my mouse to work.
What do you need?
Oh, I was just going to point.
Oh.
So we're seeing the notion of the T as one of a time, that we're then sort of recording this notion that time, or its inherent sort of traces, are one that sort of inherently gets sort of understood through sort of in a way that continuum, or the sort of repetition of sort of what actually happens before and after. I would argue that there's one slight adjustment that I would make to this diagram, is that the notion of time is not necessarily sort of even. That the sort of way that we understand sort of the crossing through that space is that it actually happens in a various rates of change. And that it's happening both, I guess, in the past, but also being projected forward. That there's, in a way, sort of past and present continually sort of happening. And that we sort of understand that sort of both as one that sort of resonates and sort of constructs a sort of notion of thickness. So this is both, I guess, one of sort of inquiry in terms of physical landscapes, but also one of an inquiry that relates to sort of, I guess, aspects in science, but also aspects, that conceptual aspects that gets taken into a whole range of other work. Can you see that sort of comes through? And then sort of, I guess there's certain writings so that come into play where the work isn't necessarily, so, you know, Exercise in Style, George Perec or Calvino, where the act of its making, or the act of sort of the narration of the landscape, isn't necessarily trying to be sort of pseudo-scientific. It's not sort of intentional that way. Although, I guess what we're doing when we're constantly designing, why I sort of refer to these, is that we're actually constantly setting up constraints for the experiment. So it's constantly sort of, as designers, what we do is not necessarily, we'll never be able to capture the real, even though we try and sort of depict and render it. But what we're trying to do is set up constraints and means for its inquiry of the landscape that then sort of enables us to potentially shift the way that we sort of represent and set up those contractual sort of understandings of our design projects. So, and then coming to the, I guess, forms of classification so the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge. So I guess this comes back to also that the shift or sort of continual, in a way, grating or rebuttal against, or pushing back against sort of maybe forms of Cartesianism. That also the way that we name and classify certain things also is one that we're consciously thinking about sort of both its relational condition, but as well as what sort of each of those, that labelling or meaning actually implies. The other bit of work that comes into play in the work, and you can sort of see, I guess quite clearly in this example by Dorothy Napangadi, who was an Indigenous artist, an Australian Indigenous artist, that falls into sort of representation that's not sort of driven by sort of, again, depicting the real, but actually depicting sort of a range of, I guess, narratives or range of conditions of the landscape that come from the landscape, but are of to a certain extent, of storytelling nature. But what you see here is that there's no clear sort of figure-ground sort of relationship, although there's a figuration of ground. So we get a depiction of, this notion of ground that isn't necessarily ground that from a landscape architecture perspective, but a ground that relates to sort of, I guess, stories of Indigenous culture. And then sort of, we try to think of sort of, in a way, these are relational, again, sort of going on these relational conditions, so the Sankey diagram, that we sort of, in a way, not dissimilar to, but maybe not as sort of beautiful as Napangati's work, but what we're trying to do is actually think about sort of the alternative figuration through maybe what might constitute these notions of flows, these ideas of landscape over time, because fundamentally what we're referring to when we think about sort of landscape over time is actually these shifts of the landscape that are being sort of influenced by sort of forces and flows. So it does sort of continually sort of beg the question of how we sort of undertake the work, but also how do we actually represent it. This was a piece of work, a very short piece of work that was part of an exhibition that ran through the cities, which was both about, and this was another lineage of work, body of work, that was about how do you record something that isn't necessarily, and how do you visualize something that's in continual state of change. So if we're recording, in this aspect, it was an open air light well. How do we record the conditions of its changing light, but how do we also record the conditions of its atmospheric changes? That isn't necessarily just about sort of setting up a set of sensors, or well, in some cases can be, but it wasn't necessarily about setting up sort of temperature gauges or wind gauges, but actually how the active design might be a force of recording. So the work then was sort of, in a way, captured and recaptured through sort of its scanning as well. So the object in space, I guess similar to the argument around Stellark, is that it's not just reading the object in some cases just as this thing in the sort of space, but one that becomes another form of its extension of the space. So we start sort of, in a way, beginning to use the scanning measure, understanding that there's always limitations in sort of the tools that we use, but as a means for understanding that the device of recording was actually an extension of that space, but then we could actually also capture the intricate sort of transformations through the density of the point cloud. And these were, in a way, these were all experiments for how we might, in a way, represent differently, make differently, but also engage with space differently. So we didn't see that the work was sort of, in a way, complete in that manner, but actually became sort of, in a way, an ongoing laboratory of how it would continue feeding into different forms of projects, or different types of projects. So you start sort of also seeing sort of moments where, this was another study of that body of work, where we're starting to see sort of an understanding of not only the recording of a singular moment, but actually understanding the sort of inherent nature of its transformation in relationship to what was going on around it. So we're sort of looking at sort of, if this is, these were 3 recordings of it that were sort of in sort of a small moment captured, that we're actually understanding, in a way, beginning to extrapolate sort of relationships between parts. Okay. So then this is another one. So this sort of records the singular surface to a certain extent, so the sort of immediate surface, and maybe not necessarily focusing on the atmospheric conditions, but focusing on sort of the one, I guess this was two things that were going on, well there's many things going on here, but this one sort of focuses on sort of the humble sunflower as being sort of an indicator in that landscape, but also how it becomes sort of another form of recorder of what's going on in the soil condition, but also a recorder of the other infrastructures and negotiation of infrastructures that are at play. So here we've got a sunflower, its growth pattern. It's basically how it responds to water and changes in season. Sort of unpacking just a simple growing process. But then we've also got sort of the humble sprinkler that we're sort of unpacking and looking at its potential means for both organising sort of the space, but also understanding that through sort of I guess the distribution of water, that there's potential sort of salt accumulation that might occur, and sort of inherent behaviours of the sprinkler, and then I guess the growth pattern of the plant as well, and then possible sort of formations and different forms of indications that actually happen in that landscape. So that's sort of looking at how, again, sort of building on sort of the work that was previously sort of shown, but then also thinking about if you've got one site, how might sort of it relate to, in this case, 15 sites, and sort of its relationship between many, and again, sort of recording, but also connecting sort of 15 disparate sites. But then also that, how do we begin to sort of influence or integrate sort of a range of stakeholders, or in a way influencers or agencies that are in that sort of that project. So we're seeing that those 15 projects are actually engaging with a range of stakeholders that then that in some cases enable different, that we're seeing the landscape as both the indicator of the soil, but also an indicator of, in a way, a large sort of community engagement. How are we going to put time here?
Oh, 10:40. It's okay.
It just keeps on going. So you're seeing, I guess, so you're seeing one of it changing over time. The cameras that we used were also not only taking sort of stills every, I think it was 3 times a day, but we also had activated cameras to be sort of sensitive to people moving through the space, so that it was recording different sort of interaction. Oh no, I don't want your update now.
Long time.
But you're also, what you're seeing here is also the engagement of, like, I think it was something like 5,000 people, both being a part of the project, but also in some cases building the project. So you're seeing more sites. And then the notion of the performative surface, so thinking about how, I guess, the works that were...
I'm sorry, Rose, what was the project section of the fourth?
Material ecologies.
No, I mean this one.
No.
What was the...
Information structures.
Okay.
So we're sort of... So continuing to explore sort of, I guess, the ongoing inquiry. So then this looks at a project that, in a way, again tries to shift away from sort of representing sort of a figure ground type of relationship, but trying to, in a way, capture the site as both a range of, a suite of information and sort of its behavioural types of conditions. This is not to sort of discard sort of any other, not to just prioritise sort of an environmental sort of perspective, but it was one of the perspectives that was captured. There were a whole range of other perspectives from, I guess, in this case, from the fisherman's perspective that were incorporated as a part of the representational system. But I guess within this suite of images, you're seeing it from both aspect, soil conditions, soil contamination, and also potential watershed. And then we're sort of beginning to think about, so this, if you think about sort of the relationship between the recorder in space and that of the island here, is that what we're trying to do is embed the potential for change or continual change to be encoded in the sort of contract, if we were to say. So if rather than thinking of it as a singular figure that has no sort of ability to change, what we were trying to do in this case was think of both the performance of the landscape but also the performance of the built environment that was a part of it, and how we might sort of, in a way, set in motion if, you know, the building typology changed or the way that we were thinking of the sort of division of the landscape changed, that how might we actually sort of embed that as a part of the design process. So what you see here is, in a way, sort of a capturing of the sort of information that you saw beforehand, which was the environmental sort of aspects. And then in sort of the various studies, you're seeing sort of variations of how we might begin to think of the urban mass differently, and how that might actually not only sort of describe its density differently, but also potentially describe its sort of building typology differently. So you're seeing portions of this come into play. And I guess the challenge with, so it was, you know, it sort of became, it was easy when we were dealing with it maybe in a singular project. So if we were dealing with it just from the sunflower, or dealing with it just from, you know, capturing sort of existing conditions. But when you actually begin to sort of incorporate maybe a range of, I guess, range of components in the design, that it becomes much more complex, but the methodology potentially remains the same. But you're continually sort of questioning how you're not sort of necessarily driving it from sort of maybe a rigid sort of Cartesian sort of structure, but actually thinking about it in terms of an encoding system. Not dissimilar to sort of, I guess, the various point clouds or the initial diagrams of those habitat flows or salt deformation of lake air. And then, I guess in this project, so then we're sort of like if the previous one was a negotiation of environmental sort of factors, the landscape and the urban, this was sort of going, okay, well, how do we make that quite explicit and understand sort of the, you know, in a way, the systems at play. So this was a project that looked at understanding or in a way exposing sort of the elements that, in this case, that we would often identify as a park, and think about it in terms of, you know, how do we subvert some of those relationships, or how do we actually make explicit the sort of what is actually being undertaken when we consider a park. That there's, you know, systems of watering, systems of basically sort of keeping things alive, but in some cases the scaffolding system became symbolic of, you know, that there's a range of supporting structures that allow for urban parks to exist. So this was the work for the International Conference of Parks, for all the national parks around the world. And so it just made explicit some of those relationships and some of those underlying sort of factors that we often disregard. And then so this is another, so continuing on that body of work, what you see to the right is a project that was trying to mark out or make an argument about sort of the relationship between a line that we draw to the line on the landscape, made of the material of the landscape itself, and seeing sort of not only the scale of its representation, the scale of the individual rock that makes up that line, but also sort of what the territorial markings are in that landscape as well. And then the video that you see to the left was going, okay, if we were to sort of completely encode the landscape through a sort of parametric types of relationships, how do we actually completely encode it? So this is one extreme, encode it so we actually make everything relational, and so but without sort of suggesting that everything behaves the same, but everything has, that all the systems at play or all the components that are a part of that landscape have inherent sort of differences in terms of the way that they behave, the ways that they negotiate. So this was a body of work that was trying to sort of go, okay, well, if we took it to the absolute extreme, how do we begin to sort of represent through its own medium to a certain extent, but also think of it all continually sort of, on one hand, made up of itself and negotiating within itself in the sort of real, but also negotiating itself within sort of the digital. And that then sort of brings me to this last body of work, which if we come back to sort of Conrad Waddington's sort of the epigenetic surface, that in this notion of the surface, we're understanding that the surface condition is something that's both inherent in the sort of performance of the surface itself, but actually one that sort of becomes very much, each component is encoded or behaves differently in relationship to its whole. So we're not sort of seeing one to be dominant over the other, but one of this sort of condition that's in a way in a continual negotiation within itself. So we got, and this comes to this is a larger project that we're talking about. So I guess the work, I've tried to show a body of work that moves through different scales and how that inquiry relates to a range of scales, but also differs, and the problem is always constantly different, and the representation technique is always different as well. But so this one is actually thinking about sort of both so this is thinking about at a regional scale how there are certain sort of factors or events or traces of history that that we're actually capturing and understanding as sort of what this site is. there's a range of, I guess, stakeholders that are a part of that landscape that influence, again, its making, that might be physically apparent in some cases, but also are incredibly invisible, but limit to what we can actually do. And then the other is sort of understanding sort of all the things that, the metabolics in a way to what's going on in terms of the various exchanges between sort of both an environmental perspective, but that of its sort of manufacturing and productive nature of the region itself. So we're seeing sort of, agroforestry, manufacturing, but also the physical sort of nature of water, it being sort of a catchment area, but also its byproducts such as, there's sort of toxic waste and all those toxic waste related to carbon and sort of mining that become a part of that sort of dialogue. And then this is an example of where we're sort of going, where we used, point cloud sort of representation and sort of setting up a system for how we might deal with mine rehabilitation. But where we're dealing with mine rehabilitation, that's not something that's done post-mining, but one that can actually be sort of developed during the mining process. So I guess in the mining process, so the region's a coal mining area, it's highly political, that every political party has their hand in it in the way that I guess we understand energy resource that is related to the coal mining, it's highly political in its nature, that everyone wants to sort of determine what the sort of future of energy is. But within this example, coming back to the fact that we're dealing with sort of large sort of areas, so these are sort of mines that are the size of Sydney, well, the depth, the volume is actually the size of the Sydney Harbour, we were looking at strategies for how you deal with mine rehabilitation while it's in process, but also how you're able to sort of communicate with the engineers that might actually be sort of excavating at the same time as well as rehabilitating. So what we set up in motion was sort of various modelling methods that were live, that allowed them to use sort of scanning sort of mechanisms to continually adapt or adjust the landscape that they were rehabilitating while they were mining. And the fact that, I guess you're seeing two videos that are playing. One is that one's talking about sort of the modelling method that we were sort of developing for the engineers. And then there's sort of a range of sort of maybe data or sort of information that was sort of determining what the model was actually doing. And understanding that the surface is not sort of just the sort of surface that we see, but it's all influenced by, I guess, the undersurface of all these sort of coal seams and soil conditions, soil stability that's driving the sort of modelling model. That's okay. And then the sort of so what you're seeing is both, before I play that, what you're seeing in the previous one, so if we come back to that just a moment, what you're seeing in this is maybe an accumulation of a body of work that was trying to both open up the way that we actually undertake sort of mine rehabilitation, also give, not only this became a negotiation tool, not only for between the engineers, but also became a negotiation tool for giving agency to the local community around it. It was continually became sort of a modelling method that allowed for visualisation, an ongoing changing visualisation of the landscape, but also that it can be evaluated for its cultural, to a certain extent, cultural values, as well as its sort of potential environmental values, so that it had a range of evaluation tools that's related to it, while less dealing with the efficiencies of mining processes. So this is where maybe again, sort of thinking about the representation and negotiation of the drawing or the model as contract. To a certain extent, this was sort of, you know, the live model as contract, where as the landscape architect, we're mediating sort of the multiple stakeholders and also with the sort of intent that we're also mediating the potential of the landscape for the betterment of the community around it. And then this, so this was another part of two projects. One where we're looking. So in this one, we used again scanning data of a simple sort of. I guess this was the regional community that we're working in. And within this, the scanning data actually not only enabled us to, I guess, represent the site to a certain extent, but also allowed us to negotiate the contractual processes differently. So we were able to, in a way, speed up the sort of documentation process as a result of having the survey data and sort of detailed survey data that the city council didn't have. It also enabled us to make quick adjustments through the design process for any adjustments that were coming as part of the design process. So if there were changes by the community or the changes by the council, that what we were constantly doing was encoding sort of maybe forms of adaptation. So that was of a different project, but we did the same for this one. Into the model. So I guess what we were trying to do was shift away from maybe linear sort of contractual processes, but actually embedding sort of a range of specificity that we would see normally down the line into sort of up front when we were working. And then, so that was within this model, and then here we're specifically sort of seeing sort of that the inherent sort of variability or iterative possibilities of what, as it moves through, what its cross-sectional sort of condition might be. Where we're seeing the cross-section not as just built form on the landscape, but seeing its sort of the range of infrastructure that is involved, but also that the cross-section has sort of a range of exchanges and sort of performative capacities related to water catchment, but also sort of how the built form had an ecological value. And then this was sort of a model that captured those sort of complexities of not only what was happening on the single surface, but actually trying to sort of represent sort of what was actually happening underneath through those sort of its geological sort of strata and sort of value. And then I'll end with this one, but this was another project that, so this is still going, so it looks at sort of what's called fatbergs. So for those who don't know what a fatberg is, it's basically large, massive deposits of waste that exist under sewers and that accumulate under sewers that are in a way a trace of our consumption at a larger scale. So there's a range of fatbergs in the US and also in the UK. Well, most cities, a lot of cities have them. And so with this work, what we were trying to do, what this started to do, I'll stop with that slide there. With the previous work, what we started to do was actually start sort of going, okay, there's ecological conditions of consumption, but there's also ecological conditions of waste. And so we've started to look at sort of developing sort of strategies for capturing things underground. So how you might sort of capture things that we can't necessarily see above ground, but how might we use sort of scanning mechanisms to deal with things that aren't sort of so visible. So, and this is sort of, again, another ongoing piece of work that's collaborative, like many of the others, but that sort of, again, sort of require a different strategy of representation and sort of discovery in comparison to the others as well. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Oh. So did you say that it's fat bug?
It's called a fatberg.
Fat bug in the sewage.
Yeah, and they're large masses. So what you'll see is that in the body of work that one is that the inquiry happens both from happening at atmospheric level down to sort of, I guess, underground, understanding that the underground is actually, or subsurface conditions are very much determining what we read on the surface condition, that, and that we're actually sort of needing sort of alternative sort of methods of both analysis as well as sort of representation to sort of deal with those complexities. So that's sort of where the argument sort of underlies in the body of work.
Great.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we take a break, like 5 minutes, so we can all prepare for discussion and questions?
Yeah.
Great. So, maybe the work of your work? Pardon? You have the work